Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be discussing when your family don't share your faith. Joining me in the studio today are Jerry Smith and Terry Messenger. Both of them are pastors. So welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Why is it that we find it challenging at times when we don't share our own beliefs with those in our family?
That's a very good question. I think for myself, I grew up from a non-Christian background. And so my mother and father are not Christians, my sister's not a Christian. And when I first became a Christian, it was very strange and very unusual for them. And I think at that time, I was very eager to share my faith and to get across to them what I believed. And looking back, I think I was very naive in the sense that I tried too hard to get my points across. And I think they thought I was some kind of nutcase, really. But I was overzealous and trying to really explain things too deeply too early on. And so I think there are tensions. To answer your question, I think there are tensions when it comes to sharing our faith with those around us, especially with those that we love, because we want to get it right and we want to say it in the right way in order for them to somehow capture that which you've experienced.
What about you, Jerry? Do you find it's awkward that your entire family doesn't believe the same thing you do?
Yeah, I would have to say so. The dichotomy between the fact that here I am a pastor, I'm preaching regularly, and talking to people about how to share their faith and the importance of sharing faith, and yet sometimes you look at your family and say, well, how come my family is not entirely converted either? And it does make you wonder. It's like, have I missed something? Am I doing something wrong? And like you, Terry, I had early experience where it was on two fronts. One of them was that I was so solitary with my faith, just trying to make sure I was doing it right, that I kind of pulled away from the family, kept to myself, And yet when I did try to share with them, it was almost like too much at once, like you were saying, and they smiled and nodded, but that was about as far as it seemed to go at the time.
How did it make you feel in those overzealous moments as a new believer or as somebody who's just been reignited with Christ? How did it make you feel when your family were not responding the same way you were responding to faith?
Well, I think for myself, I was very disappointed that they didn't react in the same way. And trying to get across my point of view, I kind of hoped that they would respond in a positive way and say, well, it's wonderful what you've experienced. But I was very disappointed that they saw it very differently and thought that I'd gone off my rocker, basically. And that was kind of upsetting. It was upsetting that was the reaction. And in those early days, it was a struggle. It was a struggle. My relationship with my family was very strained at that time. But I really felt that I knew what was right and I had to get that across.
Yeah.
But I realise now that wasn't the right way of doing it.
So I guess a Sunday lunch or a family gathering, Thanksgiving for you as a Canadian, or Christmases or anything like that, are they awkward gatherings?
Not so much these days, I think, because I've learned how to, shall we say, balance things a bit better. But initially, I do recall one specific conversation I was having with my own brother, the brother that I grew up with. We were talking about things, and I was so zealous, just so on fire, so wanting to, get the message across that literally, as my brother said, he says, is everything about God? I inserted it in every bit of conversation that I could. And I said, well, of course it is, And he kind of just turned his head and looked at me, gave me that quizzical, are you sure it should be? And at the time, I just thought, well, he's just being obtuse. He doesn't see, how important and relevant this is. But as I look back now, I realize I was probably pressing a bit much.
What would you do different today?
Well, I guess I would do what I advise other people to do and say, look at the context of your situation, Try and look for the opportunity to share your faith, but don't ram it in there, Try and find a place where it seems to fit almost naturally, shall we say.
And I can identify with Jerry on that one, simply because at first you're so zealous that you want to get that message across, and you feel in every conversation you've got to mention Jesus. It has to come up. But as time went on, I realised that that wasn't right. In fact, something quite interesting happened to me. I was visiting my mother probably 6 or 7 months after my conversion. And as I was driving to her house, it was actually like the Spirit spoke to me and said, don't mention Jesus to your mother. And I felt, well, that's very strange, you know, and I couldn't quite understand it or get to grips with it. But since that time, I've found that it's far better to be relaxed with your family and to still enjoy their company, enjoy the conversations that you have with them, whatever they're discussing, whatever you're discussing. And I've found that now, as time has gone by, my relationship with my family, with my mother, my father died sadly a few years ago, but with my sister has now been restored. They know what I believe, but I'm no longer pushing it down their throats.
And is it that over-eagerness as a new believer that makes you push, or is it the guilt that you are expected to tell people, everybody about Jesus? What is it that drives you both in many people to kind of maybe drive a little bit of a wedge into the family?
I think you mentioned a good word there, guilt. And I think for me, certainly at first, you feel that if I don't mention Christianity in some way, then I've let God down. And I should have, in fact, I used to sometimes come away, if I hadn't mentioned Christianity, feeling very down and very guilty that I hadn't done that. But I think I've since realised that is not the way, that is not the case.
I recall having feelings of guilt myself when it came to, if I felt like I had to convert a person or convict them, as it were, by the end of the day, you know, of what I believed, the whole package. And if that didn't happen, then basically they might be lost for eternity because I had failed my mission. And who knows, maybe that would impinge on me too. Maybe I'd be lost. And so I was constantly just fretting and worried and feeling guilty about these things. You know, and forget family, just anybody in general. And
but is there anything in your faith or in your beliefs within your Christian denomination that drives you, that says you are guilty if you don't convert everybody? Where does these feelings of guilt stem from?
I for myself, I think these are misplaced feelings of guilt. I think there's a thought that unless I preach the gospel, I think it goes back to the great gospel commission in Matthew 28. Go ye out into all the world, teaching, preaching, baptizing, etc. And there's this kind of feeling that if I'm not doing that all the time, then I'm letting God down somehow. But like I said earlier, I think as time goes by, you well, certainly for me, you get a more mature outlook on this. And actually preaching the gospel is far more than saying words.
That's right.
It's your life.
Yeah.
But then both of you are kind of double whammied, if you can say that, because you're also pastors. It is in your job to actually go out and share God. And how does it make you feel when your family isn't connecting with that?
Yeah, I would have to say that over the years I was struggling with that, you know, the guilt factor. But as I thought about, you know, the guilt that was sort of pushing from behind, and then I thought about, you know, the fact that I want my family to understand these things in a positive way, I realized I had to make a choice. You know, which direction am I going to go? Am I going to try to just force the issue, or am I going to try to present Jesus Christ to them in a way that's palatable, that's attractive, and even just demonstrating it in my life, rather not just words, but the way I live. You know, and I pray that, you know, these kind of this attitude of mine will then bear seed, will bear fruit, as those seeds hopefully grow over time.
You talked earlier on, both of you, very strongly on feeling you're letting God down. Why?
Yeah. And I think it goes back to that guilt aspect again, because of the Great Commission, because of the task of a Christian, if you like, to make disciples. There's that kind of feeling that if I'm not doing this on an overt basis, then I'm letting God down. But I think what I've learned is that actually it's your life. What is your life demonstrating? Very interesting what happened to me actually in regards to my mother in becoming a pastor. thankfully I built up a better relationship with her as time went by. And when I told her about the thoughts of going into the ministry, and indeed when I graduated, she actually began to tell everybody in a circle, "Oh, my son's become a minister," and she became very proud about it, And actually, since attending our church on occasion, coming to my baptism, the graduation service, one of her comments was, she said, "You are normal people after all."
That is always nice to hear, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
But for some, they may feel that your own personal salvation is at stake if you cannot convert your own family.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that helped me, actually was helped me immensely, was reading one of the Proverbs in the Bible. It's Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 16. And it's the first half of the verse. And it says, "The righteous man falls 7 times, but rises again." And I took great heart at that. I said, that's encouraging. I was like, I'll make mistakes along the way, but by God's grace, I'll get back up again. And then a friend who I showed this verse to a few days later asked me a question that literally changed the way I thought about everything. She said, "Why does it say the number 7? Why does it say 7 times?" I thought, okay, let's go back through the Bible and look at where 7 happens. I thought, the first page of the Bible is the 7 days of creation. You have things like the story of Joshua taking down, the walls around Jericho, and it's 7 days they waited, and 7 times on the 7th day they ran around that wall, and it all came down. And you have things like the 7 plagues that eventually end this world. And the thing I started looking for is, I said, all of these things have in common that God it works in a process. He could have made the world like that, but instead He takes 7 days. Of course, the evolutionists say, no, He could have made it 7 days. It had to take a billion years. That's a totally different thing. But the fact is that, the same with the walls of Jericho. He could have taken them down like that. He has His people wait patiently and through a process. And so in the end of it, I realized when it says, "The righteous man falls 7 times, it rises again." Wait, you saying God is working with me in a process? That I don't have to have this all perfectly done in one night for each and every person that I'm trying to win? It took the guilt right off. I felt so relieved. It didn't mean that I felt any less that I needed to try for Jesus. I do. I love Jesus. I want to share for Him and with Him, But it took that guilt right off.
And I think that's powerful, that guilt becomes removed, because it is not up to us to save the world. It's up to God. But we are supposed to share His word, and
Sure.
the salvation or the saving comes from God. And that sometimes we need to remember that. And I think particularly when we're very eager to share the message with those we love.
Yeah.
Because it comes down to that, doesn't it? That it's the people we love.
Sure.
That we want to experience the same great love from God that we've experienced.
That's right. And I think a thought came to my mind, Kirsten, that we sometimes get so hung up about trying to convert everybody. God Himself can't convert everybody. And that thought came to my mind quite a few years ago, that God is more eager than we are for everyone to be saved and to be in His loving arms. But even God Himself cannot force or persuade people. In fact, He won't force people.
He won't.
Because that's not His nature. He gives us all a free choice. And that kind of thought, when I realised that thought, it kind of freed me, that I'm not perfect. I can do the best I can, but I'm not perfect. I can't convert everybody. It must come from a person's own conviction, personal conviction. And I think that freed me from a lot of guilt in my early days.
And I think, which is fantastic, and I think we need to hear that, because I think a lot of us will go around guilt-driven when we have family members and loved ones who have either left the church or who haven't found God yet. And somebody asked me, what do you think is worse to go through, that your family hasn't found God yet, or your family have known God and have decided to leave? Is it different how we should approach our family members in those two circumstances, do you think?
I think there is a difference there. I think that when you're dealing with people in your own family that perhaps have never come to that point of conviction or belief, there is that freshness still. That the message is still fresh. But with a person or people that perhaps have known the faith and have then turned away, it's much harder, because they already know the message. There isn't much more you can say. And really the most you can do, I think, is pray for them, but especially continue to live the life and to respond towards them without still not forcing anything, but trying to just live the life as best you can in regards to that. I
was mentioning earlier about perhaps trying to put things into context for people. I have weighed out this question in my mind in various ways over the years, and one of the things that struck me about, especially growing up in Seventh-day Adventism, we consider ourselves what they call a prophetic movement. We feel that we're based on the prophecies of the Bible, and these things give us, in a sense, impetus for the mission we have at hand. But as such, sometimes I find that a lot of people feel that we're all called to be little prophets. And as such, we're called to say the message straight up in people's faces. And like many of these, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, these guys were called to say it straight up. Don't hold back. And many people follow that line of thinking exactly, and they tell it straight up, and it seems to fall flat. Why didn't they listen? And we just say, it's because of hard hearts. It's because they don't want to hear. But I've been thinking, Ezekiel was a prophet, and he was told things in the early chapters of Ezekiel like, if you don't say this, then their blood is on your head. But if you tell them straight, and they say no, then their blood is on their heads, right? And a lot of people will quote that, and I think that's, again, where this guilt feeling can come from sometimes. But the balancing thing that I've found helpful is when I look at Jesus Christ. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3 and chapter 4, you have two pictures, two different people. In one, you have the man named Nicodemus, who Jesus meets at midnight for a meeting that Nicodemus wanted to have a little discussion. And the other one, though, in John chapter 4, you have this woman who Jesus meets at midday. And one day I realized, as I looked at these two pictures, they're exact opposites in every respect. A man and a woman, midnight, midday. Nicodemus is at the top of the social structure of his society. This woman is pretty much the exact opposite. She's at the bottom. But the only thing they have in common in all these things is Jesus Christ is trying to win them. And Jesus, with Nicodemus, he basically gives him a verbal slap at the beginning of their conversation. But with the woman, he's massaging the conversation, and he's wooing her. And they both end up coming to Christ, but Nicodemus doesn't come seemingly out in public in a very strong way until the very end of the story, where she comes out that day. And I thought, Lord, let me learn from these things, because obviously different people require different approaches.
I think that's very wise, that different people require different approaches. I think that's something we definitely need to think about when it comes to family, because we are all different within our own family as well. But what do you do? What would you say to somebody whose family member has converted to something that I would say extreme opposite of Christianity, like paganism or like atheism? Because atheism claim it is not a belief, but some of people behave like it is a belief, and are very staunch in their proclaiming of those truths as they see it. How do you balance that within your Christian family and your faith? What would you say when people are that opposite of the spectrum? Because it is easier if people go to another Christian church, isn't it? They're like, they still have God. But paganism, you're meddling with spirits, with dark forces. And what do you say to that? How can you live in that tension?
I think you always have to respect people's opinions. People in life, people have different opinions, and they make different choices. I always say that it's good to listen to people. I think very early on in my faith, I felt that I had to continue to talk and get the point across. But at the end of the day, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I think listening is very important. And in that context, in relation to that question, if we feel that someone has gone the wrong way and feel very much has gone the wrong way in that sort of context, we should be open to listen to them and hear their experience and what they've gone through. And because if we don't listen, then there's no chance of them listening to us either.
True.
So I think it's a two-way thing. We've got to be open. Yeah. And I think also we need to be unshockable. When people talk and they say things to us and it shocks us, we need to appear unshockable and be willing to hear and listen their experience in a patient way, the way that Jesus would do, I believe.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that is part of it. Sometimes there's a fear factor there that we encounter when something's so different, especially almost antithetical to our beliefs, and we think, well, how can I even condone this or even interact? Lest I be seen as condoning, and that's a challenge. But yet when it comes to respecting, like you're pointing out, and a loving attitude, which is so necessary, even to those who are utterly opposed, utterly opposite us. Because we as Christians, of course, we have this idea that, the Bible says that, who can separate us from the love of God, right? No one, nothing. So why should we be afraid in the first place? And then if we're trying to win people, then how can we not afford to have respect, even, you know, if they totally differ, even if they're screaming in our faces?
Sure.
Or,
Yeah.
you know, but that's why I think we need to be praying as Christians, saying, Lord, you know, prepare me, because I want to be what you want me to be in that context.
Sure.
You know, I don't know how to even sometimes.
I wonder if I can share an experience in this context, because your question comes home to me very, very deeply in the sense that I've experienced that. I know my mother won't mind me sharing this because we've spoken, but my mother, when I came into the faith, she actually was a spiritualist medium and believed that she had spoken to her mother, her own mother, who had passed away. And I remember when I became a Christian that it was obviously there in the Bible that these kind of things aren't Christian. And I remember pointing this out to her very zealously at first regarding this particular belief that she had. And I remember her reaction very clearly. She got very angry. I showed her the Bible and she actually threw the Bible onto the floor. She said, "That is rubbish. I'm not going to believe that. I do not believe that." The interesting thing is, though, Kirsten, is that after that, she never went to a spiritualist church again. And that was 30 years ago. And even up to this day, she has not been back. She may still hold on to the beliefs, but to me that shows that although sometimes you don't see results, the Spirit is working as we engage and as we talk with people.
And I think that you're onto a very, very good point here, Terry. It is that just because we don't see the result doesn't mean that God has stopped working or helping the person to find faith. But what would you say? I mean, Jerry, you shared with me earlier that you had sometimes went out with somebody who wasn't a Christian. Because we encourage all our young people to find partners and in life who share their faith and belief. Yeah. The reality is it doesn't happen all the time. So from your experience, should we encourage people to only go out with people of the same faith, or how do you counsel young people or older people who are also finding new loves of their life when it comes to faith?
So, Seventh-day Adventist Church definitely encourages, like-minded, relationships, because it does make things, in a sense, almost easier overall. There's enough challenges without having different faiths, or a lack of faith, for that matter. At the time when I was in a relationship before I'd been raised in the Adventist Church, but then I'd strayed away. And during that time, I started dating this young lady. And in the midst of dating her was when I was reconverted. In the midst of that, I was brought back to Christ. And I realized, I want to get my life back on track and get back to know the Lord again. And so, since I was coming to this point in my life and realization, I said, well, you need to come along too. Yeah. Come on, let's go. And one of the things we used to fight about was her particular habit. She had a habit of, in this case, might sound small, but it was smoking. Is the only thing we used to fight about was just smoking. And I'm like, don't you realize it's so bad for you? And your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And I would go on, and we'd fight and fight. And I had good intentions, but it wasn't working. And I was trying to help her to see, and I was trying to study the Bible with her too and show her things that I was learning. And look at this. And there's somewhat of an openness, but then it would go backwards when we have these fights. So one day I felt like God was saying, just let it go. Let's stop trying. And I actually basically threw up my hands and said, God, I'm not going to try anymore because it's not working. I've made a mess. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, she calls me up and says, you'll never guess what happened. She goes, my mother bought me a Bible, and I'm reading it right now. It's great. It's fantastic. I'm loving it. I'm like, wow. Sometimes you got to step back. Again, the overzealousness can actually mess things up. But you step back, let the Lord step in, and watch what He can do sometimes. It's just a very hopeful note.
And I think that's something we need to remember, that it's not just all down to us. And some people will not come to share the same faith than us. And as you've talked about, it's important that we learn to live with that tension, that we learn to live in it. Because 30 years, and it's a long time, and we may never see a change. And that's something we also have to come to terms with, I think.
Sure. I mean, I believe that eternity will tell. I think many of us will be surprised when the time comes and we enter into eternity, and we'll see people there that we never thought would be there. And also, we'd not see people there who we thought would be there.
Yeah.
I mean, sadly, my father passed away in 1985, and I did share a piece of my faith with him. But I always wish I could explore more with him, because he never really wanted to talk much about faith. And I remember in the latter stages of his illness, he couldn't really communicate. And I was very frustrated, because I felt I need to make a point. I want to make a point, but I can't, because there's no communication. But then I realized that God has a way of breaking through. And even though he never made a profession of faith, I'm still hopeful that I will see him in eternity, even though he never made that profession while he was on this earth.
I had a similar experience with my grandfather on my father's side. Yeah. He'd been a drinker and a smoker his whole life, a carouser. He just lived a good life. Fun guy, nice guy, but not really, the Christian faith. But I remember this is about the time that I was coming to faith myself, and I was looking to ways to share, and I was living the life. And to me, maybe it was just my interpretation, but to me, it seemed like I started seeing a difference in him and some of the, the ways he was living, some of the attitudes he was taking. It seemed to be almost like a softening process. And unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter. But I mean, I kept on wondering about that, because that's family. You're thinking, Lord, what's going to happen? But all I could do is put him into the hands of the Lord. Say, Lord, you know his heart. And I just pray that the influence that I hopefully maybe had a short time to be was a positive one. But ultimately, it's into the hands of God.
I think that's all we can actually. We can hope that how we live our life and how we share, trying to balance it, not being overzealous, but just being who we are as well in our family situation and in our family settings, hopefully will help people see another picture of God that they might have seen before, or just start to ask questions. And we don't know, as Terry rightfully said, we don't know who we're going to meet here in the afterlife. And here's just to keep hoping and keep just being who we are and sharing God when appropriate, as you have said before, Jerry. And so I just want to say thank you to both of you for joining me in the studio today. And why not add your voice to the debate by joining us on our Facebook page at Faith Talks. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.